This is the third day of our workshop. In fact, it's a very nice workshop. I don't know whether you had the possibility to follow the previous 2 days. It was very interesting sessions and discussions. So we continue today, and we have today 2 plenary lectures and 2 sessions. Our morning session is chaired by Professor Bocharov. So Gennady, please, you can start the session and first plenary lecture and then continued by the session. Okay, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Foppert. Thank you, Vitaly. Dear colleagues, dear speakers, let's start our morning session. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, plenary speaker, Mustafa Adimy. And he will present his talk on modeling the relationship between antibody-dependent enhancement and disease severity in dengue infection. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Vitaly, and the organizers for this invitation. I will share my screen. It's okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we see them. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I will talk about modeling the relationship between antibody-dependent enhancement and disease severity in secondary dengue infection. I will talk about dengue, but it's not epidemiological point of view, and it's cellular and immunological point of view. I will explain also during my presentation what antibody-dependent enhancement is. Okay, as probably you know, dengue virus is transmitted by mosquitoes, and some patients may develop what we call severe dengue fever, or more severe as dengue hemorrhagic fever, that may lead to dengue shock syndrome, which is more severe than dengue hemorrhagic fever. And it is estimated that 500,000 of dengue hemorrhagic fever occur each year. This translates into 25,000 deaths, mainly children. I will explain why it's we can find more children with dengue hemorrhagic fever than adults. And the mortality rate it's around 4.4%. Dengue virus has 4 serotypes. That means 4 mutations. And these 4 serotypes are sharing approximately 80% of genetic homology. And infection with different serotypes significantly increase the risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever. Hypothesis has been proposed to explain the dengue hemorrhagic fever observed in secondary infection is what we call antibody-dependent enhancement. It indicates that pre-existing antibody facilitate the entry of the virus into target cells instead of blocking it or neutralizing. And also, dengue hemorrhagic fever can occur during primary dengue infection in babies under 1 year of age because of the antibodies they receive from their mother that was exposed to dengue virus. Okay, this is the general information about dengue virus and about dengue hemorrhagic fever. Okay, the history of outbreaks of different serotypes in French Polynesia, it's very interesting. You have here the history. In 1944, it was dengue number 1. After that, dengue number 3, and again dengue number 3, and in 1971, dengue number 2, and again dengue number 1, etc. Why it's interesting? Because French Polynesia, it's a very isolated region, and there is 300,000 inhabitants, and each time the epidemic come, it spread almost uniformly in the population, and this is interesting because we can say that almost all people in French Polynesia get infected by dengue virus for each epidemic. This is interesting in comparison with the other regions like Brazil or South of America. We have all the 4 serotypes are circulating in the same time, but in different regions. And it's very difficult to explore the data from, for example, from Brazil, because we cannot make sometimes the difference between dengue number 1, 2, or 3. Okay, this is the data for dengue number 1 in French Polynesia in 2001. That means the last, let's say, the last outbreak of dengue in 2001. And we can see with this data, there is by model age distribution of dengue fever, dengue hemorrhagic fever, and dengue shock syndrome, with 2 peaks. One peak is at babies here, less than 1 year, and a second peak is here for kids at 4 and 11 years. This second figure is the zoom of this first peak. This is in years, and this one is in months. And we can see that, in fact, the first peak is at 6 and 10 months. And I will explain you, we have to separate these 2 problems. It's not the same problem. For babies, the dengue hemorrhagic fever is different from the dengue hemorrhagic fever for kids between 4 and 11 years. It's not the same. It's let's say, the same phenomena, but not completely exact, not completely the same. Okay, now if we combine this data with the history of outbreaks of dengue serotypes, and if we make analysis of this, the 2 peaks, we can say that the conclusion is the risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever is high for people born between 1990 and 1996. Why? Because the peak is at 11 years, and we are in 2001. That means these people that are in the risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever was born in this period. And it is also, and if we look the other people, that means the people that get infected, has this dengue hemorrhagic fever for more than 15 years, they was born before 1988, and after, for this one, after 1997, because we can see also there is few cases for kids with age less than 4 years. The conclusion is the following: how to analyze this data? If you look at the people that born between 1990 and 1996, here they was exposed to dengue number 3, but sure to dengue number 2. And this is why they are in the risk, because they already get 2 different serotypes, or 1 serotypes, and now another serotype. And this is why we can see here this peak. And if you look at the people that was born before 1988, they was already exposed to dengue number 1. That means they are protected because they keep the antibodies from dengue number 1, and they are protected against the same serotype in 2001. This is why we have few cases for people with age bigger than 15 years. And also for kids that was born after 1997, after this year, that means they were never exposed to any dengue. This is why they are not at risk, except for the babies. If we look at the babies and you make hypothesis that their mother has more than 18 years old when he was born, their mother was exposed to any kind of dengue serotypes. And this is why you have to separate these two phenomena, the kids, the babies, and the kids. And this is why we say that the kids are more exposed to dengue hemorrhagic fever because their history, it's not very far, because they were not exposed to the same serotype before. It's not because of their age. Okay, now I will explain the hypotheses that are used in biology to explain this phenomena, what we call antibody-dependent enhancement, because when you take antibodies and virus, you have three cases. You have what we call high affinity to antigen. You have low affinity, and you have no affinity. No affinity, that means the virus and the antibody ignore, each one ignore itself. It's this is, you can forget it. It's not interesting for us. But for the two cases, high affinity, it's when the antibody recognize the virus and neutralize it. And low affinity, it's when the antibody, if you have the antibody comes from different virus, they share the same genetic homology, but not 100%. And the antibody bind to the virus, but not completely. And this is a problem. This is to explain the antibody-dependent enhancement, is because low affinity enhance entry of the virus into host cells and amplify the infection. And this, it has been proposed as a mechanism to explain dengue hemorrhagic fever. Okay, this is only to explain how it works for neutralization. When you have high affinity, that means the antibody and the virus comes from the same serotype. The antibody bind the virus and block him. He cannot interact with the host cell, and he cannot, the virus cannot infect the cell. Okay, but to explain the enhancement, I need more interaction, how to explain how the interaction between antibodies and viruses work. Each virus has a certain number of what we call spikes on its surface. For example, this is some example. Influenza, there is 450 spikes. For dengue and Zika, you have 60 spikes. For HIV, there is 12 spikes. This is an example coming from HIV. For COVID, we are not yet sure. We think that it's there is between 50 and 100 spikes. And each spike has a certain number of what we call epitopes. It's spike subunits. In general, it's between 2, 3, and 4 in general. Here, for this example, you have 3 epitopes. Each spike, you have 12 spikes, and each spikes has 3 epitopes. And for the antibodies, in the green color, they have what we call a paratope. Is the part of antibody that recognize and binds to an epitope. This is how it works to for antibodies to recognize the virus and to bind on it and to block it after. Okay, using this phenomena, we develop kind of antibody-antigen interaction kinetics to define what that means, blocking, neutralizing the virus, and what that means, not complete interaction between the antibodies and the virus. We consider 3 spikes with n epitopes. For example, for HIV, it's 3, n equals 3. And these 3 spikes can bind to n epitopes for the antibody according to this chemical reaction. This is the spikes, 3 spikes. This is the antibody, the epitope, paratope of antibody. And this is the number of spikes. And you have at the end of the reaction occupied spikes given by this expression. At the equilibrium of the chemical reaction, you have this equality where here this is the concentration of spikes, this is the concentration of paratopes, and this is the concentration of occupied spikes. And at the equilibrium, you have this equality where K is the equilibrium constant. And we suppose that the total number of spikes per virus is fixed. Here it's like 12 spikes, then occupied and free spikes. If you sum, you have a constant. Okay, this is in the case of high affinity. If we consider the fraction of occupied spikes, we have this expression. This is occupied spikes, and this is the total number of spikes. And if you, because we have already this equality, then we obtain this expression, and you multiply by the constant K, you divide by S, and you have the fraction of occupied spikes is given by the concentration of paratopes, of the antibodies. We suppose also that the number of paratopes per antibody is constant. Let's say K. In general, K can be equal to 1 because sometimes you can have 2 paratopes per antibody that recognize one epitope per spikes. But we suppose that in general, it's K is equal to 1. Then the concentration of antibody is directly proportional to the concentration of paratopes, and we have then the concentration of antibodies. And if we set this constant, then the fraction of occupied spikes per it's given by this expression, antibody over. If the antibody is equal to 0, there is no occupied spike. If the antibody go to plus infinity, it's equal to 1. That means all of them are occupied. This is the idea. And we have this sigmoidal response that give the fraction of occupied spikes per virus. And the fraction of free spikes, it's 1 minus this. Then you have this, what we call Hill function. And theta, this constant, can quantifies the affinity of the antibody-antigen binding. Okay, in fact, now we have, let's say this is the fraction of occupied spikes per antibody. How to define now the neutralization? We propose to define it by this expression, what we call the fraction of fractional activity of the occupied virus. Because everything here is homogeneous, we don't make a difference between spikes for the same virus, and we add a parameter alpha between occupied and free and not occupied spikes. Then we have this expression to understand if the number of antibodies go to plus infinity, the maximum fraction activity of the virus is equal to alpha between 0 and 1. That means, and if you take alpha, for example, equals to 1, this expression doesn't depend on the antibody, is equal to 1. That means if alpha equal to 1, antibody binding does not inhibit the virus activity. It's only to define how the antibody that are bind the virus inhibit his activity or not. Of course, we can choose different function, or you can take alpha depend on antibody and others. Then the fractional inactivity, that means neutralization of the occupied virus, is given by 1 minus the other function. Sorry, here I forget alpha, and it gives this expression with beta equals to 1 minus alpha. That means if we take A equals to 0, there is no neutralization. If A go to plus infinity, you will have beta. This is an increasing function. This is the maximum of neutralization of the virus by binding antibodies. Okay, now for what we call enhancement. That means if there is low affinity, that means the antibody do not interact completely with the virus. In that case, we define they interact, let's say, only with the P epitopes less than the total number of spikes. They interact only with a few, with a limited number of epitopes. And we do the same as we did for the other. We define the relative fraction of occupied spikes. This is the P occupied, and this is the total spikes. We do the same, and we find this function that we will use for what we call enhancement. And you can see it's different from the other one. If P equals to N, you will find the same as the other one, and in general, P is between, let's say, 0 and not equal to N. This is an increasing function and decreasing and go to 0 when A go to plus infinity. Here, only for simplicity, I will take this. Sorry, there is a problem with that. We suppose that this constant is equal to 1. I will come back now. I define how we can, chemical reaction point of view, how we will define neutralization and enhancement. I come back now to data that we used before. I will concentrate first here for babies less than 1 year of age. And we took data from that exist in the literature from Vietnam. They have the age prevalence of dengue hemorrhagic fever. It's for 73 babies, but they keep at the end only 13. And we can see here that the middle age, it's 7 months. Okay, and we have also data for maternal antibodies and also the age of dengue hemorrhagic fever for babies. Here you have the initial antibodies that the mother give to their babies. Here you have the real age of dengue hemorrhagic fever. Here what we call predicted age of dengue hemorrhagic fever. I give here the explanation. And this is the difference between the real age and the predicted age of dengue hemorrhagic fever. The predicted age is defined as when the antibodies are under this threshold, detectable threshold. We use the evolution of antibodies because this is passive antibodies, and we know the half-life of antibodies is about 35 days. Then the predicted age of dengue hemorrhagic fever, using this equation and using the fact that it's if it's less than 10 molecules per milliliter, the babies are not protected. And we have this expression that we put in this column using the initial B0. And we can see that the difference is almost always 2 months between the real age and the predicted age of dengue hemorrhagic fever. Okay, we propose a mathematical model for dengue hemorrhagic fever in babies. The paper was published in 2020 in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biology. This is for passive antibodies that come from mother. They are decreasing. This is the degradation of the antibody. And this is the consumption of the antibodies per the virus, because the virus consumes too much antibodies, and this is the rate of this consumption. This is, we consider here susceptible target cells. They are mainly macrophages and monocytes. This is the constant production of target cells. It comes from the bone marrow. We suppose that it's constant. This is the degradation of healthy cells. And this is what we call enhancement. That means the antibody that using the function that I proposed before to infect cells with, and this is the activity, the fractional activity of the virus when he's binded by antibodies, and the cell becomes infected with this rate. This is why you have here infected cells. This is degradation, and this is the infection that comes from these compartments. And for the virus, this is the production of the virus. We suppose that it's proportional to infected cells, and this is the viruses that are not free anymore, because they are not neutralized, but the antibodies bind the virus. A part enter to infect cells, and the other part means that the virus is neutralized, and this is degradation of the virus. Okay, we use this model, and all the parameters here comes from the literature, except the parameters related to the enhancement, because this is our contribution for this paper. And we make estimation of the 3 parameters that are new for, oh, sorry, here I make, it's not the same notation, but the 4 parameters are C, gamma, and E0. I forgot to tell you E0, it's only to say that even if there is no antibodies, the virus infect cells. The antibodies help him to infect more cells, but even if B equals to 0, you can have also infection. We make estimation of this parameter, and this is mathematical analysis of the model. Classical one, we use the method coming from epidemiology. We have 2 steady state, disease-free steady state and endemic steady state, and we calculate R0, and we use the next generation matrix as in epidemiology to define R0, and we have the same kind of result. The endemic steady state exists if and only if R0 is bigger than 1. And we can have explanation of R0 from biological point of view. Okay, and we have a classical kind of result. If R0 is less than 1, the disease-free steady state is locally asymptotically stable, and if R0 is bigger than 1, it is stable, and the endemic steady state becomes locally asymptotically stable. And we have also global stability if R0 is less than the minimum between 1 and mu2 over mu1. If mu1 equals to mu2, of course, you will have R0 less than 1, and the disease-free steady state is globally asymptotically stable. We use comparison principle and Lyapunov function to prove this result. Okay, there is one thing very important I didn't talk about. If I come back, I use this expression to define the predicted age of dengue hemorrhagic fever. And if you look, this is in vitro, okay, to define how, because there is only degradation of antibodies. If you look in the model, there is another parameter. It's the consumption of antibody by the virus. We make analysis of using this parameter for the difference between the real time of dengue hemorrhagic fever and the time that we calculate in vitro. And we can see that it doesn't depend on this parameter. This is why it's interesting to use the time using only alpha. It's only to explain this. Okay, I will show you after the end numerical simulation. Now for the other peak, that means for kids more than 1 year and adults, we have also a paper published in the same journal this year in Bulletin of Mathematical Biology. We consider now pre-existing antibodies due to the first infection that have low affinity with the virus, and the antibodies that come from the second infection with high affinity. And now we will have a competition, because for babies there is, as they have less than 1 year, they didn't develop yet their immune system. They have only passive antibodies. For kids and adults, we have 2 antibodies: the antibodies that come from the first infection and the antibodies that comes from the second one. This is the evolution of the antibodies that come from the second one. This is the constant production that come from the first infection, and there is a second wave that are activate with infected cells, and this is the degradation, and this is the consumption. For the second antibodies, there is only a new production that come from proportional to infected cells, through B cells, etc. But we don't put all the details here. This is degradation, and this is the consumption of the antibodies by the virus. This is the production of healthy cells. This is degradation. And this is the new function that I put the competition between, it's indirect competition. We separate the antibody that come from the first infection and antibodies that come from the second infection. That here we have to read it like log of neutralization. This is enhancement. It's an increasing function and decreasing, but this one is always decreasing. That means if you increase the antibodies, you will decrease this function and you will put more neutralization. Okay, this is what I called before activity of the occupied virus, the rate of activity. These cells becomes infected. We go from here to here. This is degradation, and this is the production of the virus, and this is how the antibodies bind the virus. That means they are not free anymore, and the part of them infect cells, the other part are neutralized, and this is degradation of the virus. Okay, here very quick mathematical analysis of the model. We have also 2 steady state. This is free steady state and an endemic steady state. We cannot calculate explicitly, but there is a unique endemic steady state, and we develop the technique coming from next generation matrix, coming from epidemiology based on next generation matrix to define the what we call matrix of infection and make it matrix of transition. Here for us, the infection is the virus and the infected cells. This is why here we have 0, 0, because it's transition, because it's inside the infection compartment between the production of the virus by infected cells and the production, the infected cells by the virus. It's only transition. Okay, and this is the new infection that comes from healthy cells. And we have also, we can develop R0, and we have the same kind of results. The endemic steady state exists if R0 is bigger than 1, and it is locally asymptotically stable if R0 is bigger than 1, and P0 is globally asymptotically stable if R0 is less than 1. This is a classical result that works work very well for this model, even if it's complicated model. For the global stability, it was hard because you have here this function is not monotone, and you cannot apply directly a Lyapunov function. We use a comparison principle and a Lyapunov function to prove the global asymptotic stability of the free steady state. For numerical simulation, we define the arrows here indicates the time at which the maximum of infected cells occurs. This is supposed to represent the occurrence of dengue hemorrhagic fever a few days after infection. And it corresponds also in the same time when the virus is the maximum. It corresponds also when the infected cells is on the maximum, and also enhancement just after when the neutralization becomes over there is only a small window when we can have this, when the enhancement is in the maximum. What else? The dashed line here, this one, it's this correspond to the threshold for virus detection. Here, the simulation, the line red, blue, etc. It's for R0 less than 1, and the other one is for R0 bigger than 1. But that doesn't mean that the steady state here is 0. The steady state is endemic, but it's very low. And for this kind of model, R0 becomes big very, very quickly because each virus produces too much infected cells, and each infected cells produce million of virus. This is why we are not surprised to have R0 very big. But we are interested only here, not asymptotic behavior, but only transition for the few days. This is very interesting. We were not expecting to have this kind of behavior. If alpha 1, it's the production, the rate of production is antibodies production rate by infected cells. Alpha 1 is for antibodies number 1, and alpha 2 is for the antibodies number 2. We were expecting if you increase the production of the antibodies, the maximum of infected cells will decrease, but in fact it's increase in the beginning and decrease after reaching the maximum, and this was not expected. That means if you increase the production of antibody that enhance the disease, it doesn't mean that you will increase the infection. There is a kind of window when the infection is very high. And also you can see for the time at which the dengue hemorrhagic fever occur, it's in terms of this parameter, it's increasing, go to the top and decrease. And here it's we are not surprised because if you increase the production of the antibodies that can neutralize the virus, you will decrease the maximum of the infected cells. But you increase also the time at which this maximum occurs. This is also very interesting. Now we are interested to see this maximum and the time when this maximum occurs using the initial quantity of antibodies, because this initial quantity, let's say, come from the first infection, and we can see that it's almost stable until a certain threshold of this antibody and decrease very fast. That means there is always a number of quantity of antibodies that we get from the first infection that increase the risk of to have dengue hemorrhagic fever. And here also the time is almost stable between 0 and 10 days, and it increases very fast after certain threshold. But this part, it's not interesting because as the maximum of infected cells fall down, it has no meaning for us this time. And also we have this figure about R0 using the equilibrium of antibodies that come from the first infection, and we can see that there is a kind of window where the risk is very high. Also for antibodies that come from infected cells. That means in general, if the time between, because this can measure also the time between the first and second infection. If the time is small, we are protected, and also if the time is very long, we are protected. That means the time between the first and second infection is important to have high risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever. But for this, we don't have data. We have only like a remark about, we know that this time is important, but we don't have real data to explore. I think I will finish here. This is, thank you very much. And this is the references that I use. And you have the two papers that this talk was based on. And you can find preprint free in internet for the two papers that was published in Bulletin of Mathematical. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Adimy, for your very interesting talk. And we have 3 minutes for questions. Dear colleagues, please, could you ask? Yes, please. Professor Wolpert.
Yes, hello. Yes, Mustafa, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Could you please tell us, when you consider these different types of dengue, serotypes 1, 2, 3, 4, is there cross immunity between them?
Yes, there is cross immunity also, yes.
Okay.
There is cross immunity, but for a very short period. I think it's maybe 1 month or something like that, yes.
So in fact, in your modeling and in the data, it's not so important, right? Because it's very short.
Yes, exactly.
And what about a long-time immunity? There are no memory cells there?
No, yes. Here, I for example, for the second model, we don't consider directly the memory B cells. We make the production proportional to infected cells because the model will be too much complicated. Of course, there is a memory.
But in reality, there are memory cells.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. In reality, yes.
Well, if there are no other questions, I will continue.
Sorry. To complete, there is memory cells for both viruses. This is why it's complicated. It means you activate also memory cells that comes for the first infection, and you activate also, not activate, but you increase also memory cells that come from the second infection. Both are, yes.
Well, Gennady, can I ask another question?
Yes, please. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think if I understood correctly, you told us that this hemorrhagic fever corresponds to the maximal viral load. Is it so?
Yes, exactly.
And this maximal, and then you showed this graph, this blue line of this maximal, when the time when this maximal viral load is reached, and this graph is not monotonic. It depends. It grows, then it goes down, but it depends on what. What is a parameter which determines the time to reach the maximal viral load?
I think we make the most parameter is the parameter related to what we call enhancement. That means how the antibodies coming from the first infection help the virus to infect cells. And there is a competition between them. And after that, the parameters come from neutralization, becomes over the other. And in that case, the problem is you will not have the same behavior of the solution.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can discuss in more detail after that, because we probably have to move to the next talk. Thank you very much, Mustafa.
Thank you very much. Yes. I mean, dear colleagues, we move to the second talk to be, presented by Banerjee. Please, go ahead. This is the lecture about disease progression in a two-group epidemic model validation with COVID-19 epidemics. Please, Professor Banerjee.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for kind invitation to deliver this talk in this nice gathering and scientific meeting. So in this talk, I'll talk about some of our joint work with Vitaly and some of other colleagues, and that is disease progression in a two-group epidemic model, model validation in the context of COVID-19 epidemic. Okay, so first I'll give you some introduction, although COVID-19 don't need any introduction right now because it is known to each and everyone. And then I'll talk about some simple epidemic models to have some basic idea that what kind of thing can be done, or at which level we need to modify the model in order to cope up with the epidemic progression of COVID. And then I'll briefly talk about our work on vaccination, that how it can reduce the further progression of the epidemic, if of course assuming the vaccines are effective, and towards the end definitely I'll come to some references. So these are the well-known common pictures that you can see at different places, and we are all familiar with all these words, and there is no need to explain each and every of these phrases differently, but just to give you some sort of feeling that we are talking about COVID. So some pictures and some sort of this kind of terminology is placed here. So now if we look at the data for the total number of daily infection across the globe up to 18th of September, this is not up to the date. You can see it has different types of progression at different time points, and we have to keep in mind that this progression or the importance of the picture is that, or figure is that, this total epidemic progression contributed at the global level is not showing the same behavior if we consider the disease progression in different countries, and then afterwards if we look at the micro scale at different regions, different cities or different localities, we will be having a completely different pictures. Now simple epidemic model which or simple epidemics or other kind of epidemics which causes death, there are sometimes we can find a direct ratio between the number of infected and number of deaths. But in case of COVID, if we just try to understand this simple fact from the data, whether they are directly correlated or not, then we can find several discrepancies, because healthcare response and effective tracing of the disease or detection of the disease at an earlier stage made a significant difference of the disease related death, and this number is varying from one country to another. So this is the daily death data across the globe that we can see from the worldometer data. But one thing is very much clear: the peak of daily death is more or less correlated with the daily death, daily infection data across the globe. Now, if we look at the cumulative number of cases for some countries like Brazil, India, Iran, and etc., so we can clearly observe the total number of infection up to that day that I have mentioned earlier, middle of September of this year. Then the total number of cases is maximum in case of United States, and this is lying just above the data for India, and then we can find Brazil. But if we look at the cumulative death data of the same countries, then we can see there is some sort of alteration. In case of death, what we can see that the cumulative number of deaths in Brazil is comparatively high when we compared with India, and also there is some sort of alteration in these cases. But at this moment, I cannot make a clear-cut comment that this death in Brazil was on a much higher side and India on a lower side, because personally I know there are some restriction of the data which were transmitted to the media. There is some sort of lag between real situation and the data reported so far. But as far as data is concerned, which is available, which is black and white, based upon that we can see that number of deaths, cumulative deaths in Brazil up to that day is on a higher side compared to India, and also this is true that there is some sort of alteration if we compare with the total number of infection in some other countries. But what is interesting here, that you can see that these are the daily number of reported cases for COVID-19 for 4 different places. First one, this one is for USA, this one is for UK, this is for Brazil, and this one is for Germany. So what we can observe, that appearance of peaks at different countries, they are completely different with respect to the time scale. So whatever some kind of high number of infection which was reported daily in Brazil during this period, at the same time we can see a little bit different picture when compared to US, US, UK and Germany. So this kind of variation is mainly related to the different type of control measure they have taken, and also some sort of relaxation of the control measure or restriction across the country. And most importantly, which is required to be explored in days to come, that how emergence of different kind of strain is responsible for growth or different size of outbreak in different countries. It may happen that there are some sort of discrepancy in the number of testing or level or type of test that might be responsible, but for that some sort of microscopic or some sort of minute investigation is required at a different front that is not solely related with the mathematical modeling of the disease. So what we can our main goal is to come up with a reasonable model for this kind of epidemic progression. But if we look at the different modeling approach, so depending upon the nature of the disease or target of the scenario which we are interested to capture, there are different types of modeling approaches are available. This is a list of such different type of modeling approaches. This is not the exhaustive list, but this is a part of the list which are available, or I can say I know little bit about each of them. But in this talk, we are going to talk about mainly ordinary differential equation model. Now, once we talk about ordinary differential equation model, then first question may arise that ordinary differential equation model, if it is of autonomous type, So then it means that if we know the current state of the system accurately, then we can predict about the future in a deterministic way. But in case of COVID, this is not the case. Rather, it is completely unpredictable at certain stage. So the question is that why we are interested to talk about ordinary differential equation model. So this ordinary differential equation model is of course ordinary differential equation model, but not exactly autonomous type. There is some sort of time dependence variation, and main contribution of our work in this case to show that how if we move from one group epidemic model to two group epidemic model, and also variable rate of infectivity can capture the occurrence of multiple outbreak of this particular epidemic disease. So this is the classical and most simple epidemic model, which is based upon three compartments, that is susceptible, infected and recovered, with the simple assumption that susceptible individuals when come in contact or within the close proximity of the infected individual, they become infected and they leave the susceptible class and join the infected class, and there is a rate of recovery which is alpha. So actually 1 by alpha is the measure of average infectious period of the infective individual, and after that they become recovered. And in this case it is assumed that there is no disease related fatality. So for the well-definedness of the model, we need to start with some non-negative initial condition, and in this case what we can observe that there is no change in the population size during the epidemic progression. And one important thing is that whether there will be a growth in the number of infective, that is somehow determined by the quantity beta times St minus alpha. So at the initial stage, that means this equation di dt equal to this one can be right hand side can be factorized as beta s minus alpha multiplied by I. So I is of course a population, size of the population. It is always positive, we can say, without any loss of generator. So that means assuming there is at least one infected individual. So then beta st minus alpha will be either positive or negative. If it is positive, then there will be a growth in the number of infected, and if it is negative, then there is a decline. But what is important here, this model assumes that if rate of infection is constant, recovery time is fixed, then initially there is a possibility of growth of the epidemic. Then peak will be appeared at a particular time when beta st is equal to alpha, and then it will decline. So from that conception we can calculate the basic reproduction number R0 is equal to this much. So if n is the total size of the population, and if there is a onset of the epidemic, so that means there is a single infected individual is assumed to be there. So this actually determines whether there is a possibility of growth of the disease or not. And this beta n by alpha can be obtained from this particular factor, that is beta s minus alpha, assuming s is equal to n, and it is significantly larger compared to I equal to 1. So without any loss of generative, we can assume S is more or less equal to N, and that's why it gives this particular measure. So if this is greater than 1, there is an onset of the epidemic disease, and what we can find mathematically, we can calculate the final size of the epidemic, that is given by this one. So that means ultimately how many individual will be infected, and also we can determine what will be the maximum number of infected and at which time it will appear. This is a simple mathematical calculation, and I am not going into the details. And in this case, this is actually taken from the book by Maya Marcheva for a single outbreak of influenza in a school in UK. This is a case of a long back. It was the data from, if I recall correctly, 1978. And these black dots corresponds to the data points, that means number of infected, that is data, and this blue curve is the numerical simulation result, so it can easily capture the disease progression and single outbreak of the epidemic. And what we can see that there is a decline in the number of susceptible individuals. Initially there is an increase in number of infected, and then there is a decline, and this yellow color curve shows the total number of recovered, and it is starting from 0, and again it's going to saturate to some level. So this is the case of single outbreak epidemic model. So then for influenza model, what is another important aspect, that apart from the susceptible, infected and recovered, there are two more compartments. One is latently infected and another one is asymptomatic. So that means infected compartment can be divided into two parts, one group with symptom and other group without symptom. And in this case, the model looks like this one, and the term delta is related with the fact that how or at which rate asymptomatic individuals they are transferring infection to the susceptible individual, and that comes into the measure of the basic reproduction number. So this is a straightforward calculation, and you can get all the details from this particular book. But what I want to mention here, that in case of epidemic model in concerned or in consultation with the COVID-19, there are several papers where people have considered this kind of demographic term. But according to my understanding, this demographic term is not well justified, because this actually measure at which rate healthy individuals they become susceptible. In order to have an appropriate measure for this one, we need a long time data for a particular disease, and in the context of COVID, I think that time point is not arrived right now from where we can get an understanding or an estimate for this one. And also the natural death rates is not a good choice to include into the model, because this is taking place, or this is takes place over a slower time scale compared to the COVID related death rate. So that's why this death rate might not be a good choice to incorporate into the model. But mostly people love to do it because some mathematical calculation like endemic equilibrium, then disease-free equilibrium, their stability can be judged. But that is not a good choice for COVID kind of diseases. Must be a good one for established diseases for which we have a long history is known to us. So what we have done for mathematical modeling of COVID, we have actually considered this many compartments. So S stands for susceptible compartment. Then exposed individuals are divided into two compartments. One is non-infectious and another compartment is exposed but infectious. Then infected individual again divided into two groups. That is not two groups, rather two compartments, one without symptom and another having symptom. And then we have three more compartments here, that is quarantined, hospitalized and recovered. So the understanding is that once the infected individuals, that means with symptom, or rather we can say which are detected to be positive, some of them they are asked to go for quarantine for certain days, and that's why we are not considering that from exposed individuals or susceptible individuals, maybe who have traveled from one place to other, they asked to go for quarantine. So that is not considered into the model. It was done a long back, if I recall correctly, by the end of May or beginning of June 2020, we did this work, and the hypothesis is that at that time we did not consider that some quarantine compartment will be contributed from the susceptible individual or exposed compartment. And this is the flow diagram of the disease propagation, and what is assumed here, that death toll due to COVID can be contributed only from two compartments, that is symptomatic and also hospitalized compartments. So assuming that healthcare facility is good enough such that they can monitor each and every individuals who are detected to be positive, and enough hospital beds are available. Of course, that was not the situation across the globe, but in order to make the model little bit simpler compared to most realistic one, these assumptions are made, and model looks like this one. I am not going to discuss or describe each and every terms, but if anyone is interested, they can look at our work, and this is the interpretation of different parameters involved with the model. This is the range of values and also units involved with the model. So what we have considered in that case, we have actually divided the rate of infection into 3 different parts. So one before the onset of lockdown, then first couple of days during the lockdown, and then the value of beta after the lockdown. So from estimation, we have calculated for Germany that this beta value is 3.98 before the onset of lockdown. This is during lockdown, and first couple of days, the first 12 days of the lockdown implementation, and afterwards is reduced to 1.05. So of course one can raise the question how you are assuming that it was at a higher level, then it comes to a middle somewhere in between, and then to a lower level. So this is somewhat controversial, but we can defend those kind of comment by our work. What we have done, we have actually considered 2 different cases. In one case, we are assuming it was on a higher side, but you know, immediately after the implementation of the lockdown measurement, there will not be drastic change in the rate of infection because there is a latency period that is responsible. But what we can assume that after certain time, the spread of infection, that means rate at which it is spreading, that will be lowered. So it can be considered different types of function. So we have considered 2 type of function. One is higher at some initial time, then during first couple of days during the lockdown, it is at an intermediate level, and afterwards it was at a lower level. Or what we can consider that it is actually decreasing function from this higher value to lower value. But the interesting point what we like to make here, that this range, that means the number of days during which it is remain at an intermediate level or during which it declines from this higher value to lower value, that is actually estimated from the data. And once we match with the data from Germany, we can see it is a reasonably good match for the data. And these are the 95% confidence interval for cumulative number of cases and daily reported cases. And this model is also checked with data from other countries, and it also shows very good agreement during the first outbreak. Now the question was that what we tried to capture in this case, what will happen once the lockdown restrictions are withdrawn. So then we considered a 2-group epidemic model with the assumption that one group of people, they are following all the COVID related protocol, and another group of people is not following the COVID related protocol. So if that happens, then our model outcome actually indicates that suppose 10% of the people of total population is violating such kind of restrictions and 90% people following the COVID related protocol. So it shows that there is a chance of slow growth of the epidemic, although for certain time period the basic reproduction number remains less than 1. And in case if it is the case that 20% of the people is not following the restriction, so we can see that there is a rapid growth of the epidemic once the lockdown restrictions are withdrawn. And with these parameters set up, what we have calculated at that time, maybe the second wave might be 4 to 7 times higher compared to the first wave if more than 20 to 25% people don't follow this restriction. And then we actually verified this model with some realistic data, one from Spain. It is a good agreement that, and in this case, if I recall correctly, the percentage of the people, that means estimated value of the ratio is 22 to 78, that gives a onset of rapid growth of the second peak. And further, we verified these things with the data from Israel, and it can also capture with the variable infectivity that non-monotonous growth of the second wave. And then I quickly come to our another work on this particular vaccine. So in this case, what we have assumed that again population is divided into two groups. It is not on the same terminology that okay, that one group is always not following the protocol, another group is following the protocol. Rather, two group can be considered into this way. One group is having some comorbidity and another group having without comorbidity, or we can consider one group is some kind of super spreader, and maybe due to their work assignment or their job or some other restrictions, they are bound to travel or meet with several people, interact with several people. So there is a chance of higher rate of transfer of the disease from one individual to many individual. And then what is assumed here, that requisite number of vaccine is not available at a time in good number. Then the question is that how it can be distributed into two groups in order to control the epidemic spread within a reasonable time period. So what we observe, that suppose the division of the people between two groups is 10% and 90%, and all this is the case of the plot in green color, and in case it is 20 to 80, this plot in red color, and blue corresponds to 30 to 70 division into two groups. So two things, it is very much clear that entire population is not required to be vaccinated. So if we vaccinate more than this many people in V1 compartment and more than this many people in V2 compartment, so if we are somewhere here, so then there is no possibility of further epidemic growth. That is actually prediction from the model analysis. And you can clearly observe that if the distribution of the number of individuals into two groups increases, then total number of requirement of vaccine is also increased. And then the next question is that how to distribute the vaccine. So what we have assumed that okay, that vaccine is not available at a time, rather a fixed number of vaccine may be available after a regular interval of time. So what is assumed, that 10 to the power 6 vaccine will be available after fixed time step. And then what we considered that it is randomly distributed into two groups. Then what will happen, that follows this particular curve with black dots, and then the total number of that means maximum number of infected per day is measured close to 2500. That means scaling for this black curve is on the right hand side and scaling for other curve is on the left hand axis, vertical axis. And these are some randomly generated numbers with the assumption that these are somehow strategically divided into two groups. And this shows that if we follow this particular path, that means path with red dots, then in this case the maximum number of infected on a particular day will be much less compared to others. So what we can say, that depending upon the distribution of number of individuals into two groups, we need to decide at which rate or who will be given preference to vaccinate, and that have a significant effect on the control of the epidemic disease progression. Now, of course, natural question arises that if we can vaccinate all the people or requisite number of people, it can be stopped. Time will tell us about the details about these things. That means whether some new strain can be managed by this vaccine or some sort of repeated vaccination is required. That is, some sort of booster dose is required. That is required to be understood. So this is all about my presentation. Apart from that, we have some other work in this area. and these are the data sources from where we have collected the data, and these are my collaborators with whom I have done this work and I have presented today just for your information. And thank you very much, and I hope I am within the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee. Questions? Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your very insightful and actual study. I was, very impressed by the, consistency. May I ask you, a question?
Yeah, please.
Following, question. So, in the modeling framework that you follow, it is supposed the well mixing, hypothesis is, present, right?
Yeah.
So do you consider that it is not so important to trace the contact patterns using
definitely
the,
definitely it is important, and what I believe, or we believe, some sort of multi-scale modeling will be also required. For example, in case of country like India, in one work what we have done, we have actually considered that all the people are not concentrated at a particular place. So major cities or big cities, there is a huge concentration of the people. So epidemic progression in that particular city will have a completely different picture when compared to the respective state, and the disease propagation in the respective state is completely different when compared to the entire country. So that means contact tracing or individual based disease spreading, this trace is very much important. But getting data or mathematical modeling of that particular thing is of course of great interest. That is very much important.
And just, second short, question. You, showed nice, consistency of the model with the data. Did you try also to make, predictions? And for how long it can be used?
No, because so far the literature, what I have considered, they have mentioned that in case of COVID, we cannot predict more than 15 to 20 days. Because the thing is that depending upon right now we can make a prediction, but what kind of change in the policy is going to come up in coming days, nobody knows, and whether there is a arrival of a new strain or some other complexity is involved, that is not tractable easily. So
thank you.
we did not make for this any kind of prediction.
Thank you very much. Other questions, please. Yes, there were questions also from, Professor Wolpert and Professor.
Yes. In fact, Alberto was going to ask question, but then just his hand disappeared. Alberto, if you want to ask questions, so go ahead, please.
Yes, not more than a question, is a comment that I congratulate with Malai and co-workers, including Vitaly, because I think that although these pandemics are shown without a doubt that the human behavior, that is as in the model, the different acceptance on of the restriction are fundamental for the dynamics.
Exactly.
The vast majority of all the papers published on COVID do not take into account this.
Yes.
And Malai and Vitaly and co-worker were about the first to include, because it is the experience is very strange, because people, including mathematical modeler, have their life, daily life, go out in the street and see different behaviors, but they don't include in their model. And what is even more funny, that is the vast majority of paper published in so-called high-impact journal like Nature, PNAS, Nature Communication, etc., etc., etc. I have one opened in my desk, for example, do not include human behavior, which is on the contrary extremely important. This was my comment, more than a question.
Thank you.
And that's why very clear presentation.
I show the reference of your book, that human behavior, how it affects the epidemic disease progression, that is most important in the context of COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, please. Vitaly, maybe you? Vitaly?
Yes, thanks. I was just going to make a very short remark because we have little time now. Mali showed in the beginning of your presentation, you showed this world data, this, for example, new daily cases. And then you explained that it can be very different in different countries or regions. But still, if we take this overall data from the whole world, we see a very clear periodicity of this data. This is intriguing for me because, you know, in each country, the public authorities decide this lockdowns and other social restrictions, but somehow on the level of the whole world, this becomes somehow synchronized. And we have a rather precise periodicity of these outbreaks with a period between 4 or 5 months. And it looks like we have now the beginning of the new race of this pandemic. So, and I think that this question was not sufficiently discussed in the literature. Why on the global level we have this exact or rather exact periodicity? So maybe we can think also about this question, but unfortunately we don't have more time for discussion. So thank you very much again for this very interesting and in fact important at this time presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Dear colleagues, we move now to the next talk. Karam Allali on global analysis of a multi-strain SEIR epidemic model with general incidence functions, application to COVID-19 disease. Please, Karam, go ahead.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me. I would like to thank Professor Vitaly for inviting me. Today, I will talk about global analysis of multi-stream SEIR epidemic model with general incidence functions. And we will see later application on to COVID-19 disease. This work is in collaboration with my colleague Omar Khia at the Laboratory Mathematics, Computer Science and Application, Faculty of Science and Technology, University Hassan II of Casablanca, Morocco. The outline of my talk will be like this, what you see on the screen. I will start by describing the two-stream SEIR epidemic model with general incidence rates. Next, I will move to mathematical analysis of the problem, which means I will talk about the positivity boundedness of solutions. This results like all biological or mathematical biological models, mathematical models in biology or medicine. We need to check that the variables are positive and bounded. For example, the cells, the amount of cells are always positive and bounded. during the time, of course. Next, I will move to describe the different steady states of the tackled problem. These steady states will show how it's whether it's we have not the disease or we will have the disease, and as mathematics studies of biologic in general, we need to see if those steady states remain stable or unstable during their evolution. Next, third part of this talk, I will show some numerical simulations of the studied problem. The first numerical simulation deal with the stability of the disease-free equilibrium. Next, I will show the stability of the first strain endemic equilibrium, followed by the stability of the second strain endemic equilibrium, and the last endemic equilibrium will be also shown in this talk. I will finish by some this third section by some comparison with COVID-19 clinical data. We will take with my colleague. We have compared our numerical simulation with the Moroccan clinical data to predict one wave of the disease. Like you see, the problem of mathematical models is to predict long time of behavior of the disease. This is the problem, and unfortunately, our model can describe the disease, but only for one wave of the disease. And the fourth part of this talk, I will show briefly another same problem of three-strain SEIR epidemic model with general incidence rates. First, I will give three-strain SEIR epidemic model, so we can see that some compartment will be added. The compartment will represent the third stream, and I finish the fourth part by some numerical simulations. The interest of this talk is to describe when we have some multiple mutation, like we see now. It's in the disease there is multiple mutations of the disease, and we want to see what happened with if we can have like this situation. We can have some multiple mutations of the COVID-19. This is one aspect of this problem, but there is another aspect of the problem. I finish the talk with some references. The model of two-strain, like you see here, of two-strain epidemic model, COVID-19 epidemic model, will be described by this following the system of differential equation. We have 6 equations. The first equation describes the evolution of the systems. The second equation describes the evolution of the first strain exposed individuals. The third equation describes the evolution of the second strain exposed individuals. The fourth equation describes the evolution of the first strain infected individuals. The fifth equation describes the evolution of the second strain infected individuals. And the last equation describes the recovery. As you know, the recovered can be autoimmune or vaccinated, or the important is they are recovered, so they are not more infected. So the parameters of the problem are like this: is lambda is recurrence rate, and here we have the mortality rate is delta. You see here the mortality rates. The natural, there is two mortality rates. There is delta here, as you see here, minus delta S, minus delta E1, minus delta E2, minus delta I1, minus delta I2, minus delta R. Delta here is the natural mortality rate. So here we see that gamma 1 is the mortality caused by the infection of cell. So here we can see gamma 1. Gamma 1 is the latency rate of strain 1, and gamma 2 is the latency rate of E2, of the second strain. And here mu1 and mu2 are the transfer rate from infected to recovered. mu1 is the transfer rate from the first strain infected rate to recovered rate, and mu2 is the transfer rate from infected rate I2 to R. So the initial conditions are assumed to be positive or equal to 0, greater or equal to 0. Every initial condition are greater or equal to 0. What is new here in our model? What is new in our model is the generalized incidence rates, what you see on your screen by the red color. So we'll take here two generalized incidence function. The first is denoted by F. The second is denoted by G. So if I want to give some examples of F and G, for example, when we are interested by bilinear incidence function, F or G will be beta S, beta multiplied by S, or beta is infection rate. If we are interested by saturated incidence function, those functions can be beta S divided by 1 plus alpha, certain alpha, multiplied by S or I. If we are interested by beta and de Angelis, for example, incidence function, we will have dose function equal to beta S divided by 1 plus alpha S plus beta alpha 1 S plus alpha 2 I. If we are interested by Crowley-Martin incidence rate, we will have beta S divided by 1 plus alpha 1 S plus alpha 2 I plus alpha 1 multiply alpha 2 multiply as I. If we are interested by non-monotonic incidence rates, we will have beta S divided by 1 plus alpha I square. I square. This is some examples of F and G, and why I said all this example is that our demonstration after we will fulfill some hypotheses. Okay, so I will move forward. The flow chart of two-stream SEIR model is like the following. We can show the model like equation like you see on the screen, and we can describe the model like flow chart. The two reflects the same thing. We can do it by equation, and we can represent it by a certain flow chart. So we have some arrows here. The entering arrow is the recurrence rate, for example, here, and delta S is the natural mortality rate. Here you can see the other arrows are the transfer rates. Here you have transfer rates. For example, mu1 is transfer rate, mu2 is transfer rate, gamma 2 is transfer rate, etc. Well, so in this epidemic model, the exposed. So I need to remember one thing. That is the first SEIR model is described in 1927 by Kermack Mathematical. So the first SEIR model is described in 1927 by Kermack Mathematical. Before the individual become infected, there is one period called incubation period. So in this incubation period, we can add one class or more classes. We can add multiple classes between S and I. And we are interested here in our model by the class E, the exposed. So the exposed, we call it in this work, the exposed. They are during the incubation, but they are not infectious. So E1, they are then there is incubation. The virus enter to the they are carrier of virus, but they are not. So they are not infectious. So some brief literature of the model, the recent, but because there are many other literature before 2017 on the same model. So if we take the same model in 2019, the same model was studied by Ben Taleb and Amin in their Journal of Biomathematics 2019. They took a bilinear incidence function and non-monotonic incidence function to generalize infection rates. 2017, they take another problem, the same without exposure, but it was the same for the same general incidence function. So I will talk exactly the same. If we take exactly the same, we see the literature 2019, we do these two incidence function. After that, in 2020, same model with two non-monotonic incidence function. It was studied in by Miskaf et al. In journal Carlson, Solid and Fractal by taking these two non-monotonic function. So the incidence rates reflects the behavior between the individuals and how the infection can be transferred from an individual to others. If they are in some homogeneous medium or not homogeneous medium, there is many factors describe what is best incidence function to some special cases. But the normal and the basic infection rate is bilinear infection rate. The generalized incidence function was published in 2020 by Khiyar and Allali in nonlinear dynamics, and we have generalized the two incidence to three incidence function in will appear in proceedings Nodicon in 2022. So the first results is the classical results of positivity and bondiness. For the bondiness, we can sum all the compartments. We have this dn divided by dt equal gamma minus delta nt, and we solve and we'll find the upper bound, and we'll find that the problem is bounded. The positivity, there is many methods. So to showing the positivity of this kind of problem. Since the first 5 equations of system are independent of R, so we can omit the last equation, and we have only 5 equations like you see on your screen. Here we, as my colleagues before, many of my colleagues in this conference talk about how to find the basic reproduction number. We can find it easily by the next generation matrix method. And what is like it's like if we have two-stream multi-stream, we can have R0 like maximum of, for example, of two some production number, and we call R01 the string 1 reproduction number and R02 the string 2 reproduction number. These names are coming from because R01 is dependent on F and R02 depends on G, and we have this formula. The first the steady states. So we have 3 steady states, and we have string 1 endemic equilibrium exists when R01 greater to 1. String 2 endemic equilibrium exists when R02 greater to 1. The third endemic equilibrium exists when both of the string endemic the bond string basic reproduction number are greater to unity. So when the proof, it's obvious. It's all simple. Is to solve the system of equation. It's very simple to find the reproduction. Sorry, it's too simple to find the equilibria. So here, when I1 equal different to 0 and I2 different, we find this. It's just simple to find. S1 at 1 star belong to the interval 0 gamma divided by delta. This condition is to ensure that the second component and the fourth component is greater or equal to 0. The same thing we can find by the same manner. We can find the strain to endemic equilibrium, and you can find the both strain endemic equilibrium. So for the global stability, I recall that global stability of the basic three equation. Three equations mathematical biological problem was already done by Grebennikov, I think the year 2002, I think 2002, and here we have more compartments. So the difficulty here in the demonstration is to find the right Lyapunov function. So for the first results, if R0 less or equal to 1, the disease-free equilibrium EF is globally asymptotically stable. This results is like many of other studies. So the idea is to have Lyapunov function like in this formula, and to check that the time derivative is negative, so the energy doesn't grow. It's have dissipating energy. It's like some energy of the problem. So here, the strain 1 endemic equilibrium is globally stable when R02 is less or equal 1 and strictly equal to R01. The Lyapunov function is like this, can have this following form, and the strain 2 equilibrium point ES2 is globally asymptotically stable under this condition, and the Lyapunov function can take the following form. And the last endemic equilibrium is globally asymptotically stable when both of the strains endemic. Both strain basic reproduction number is greater than 1. For the numerical simulation, we can see here for given parameters, we have shown that if we have tested for the bilinear incidence function, which are dotted red, beta-intern de Angelis yellow, Crowley incidence function green, and non-monotic incidence function. We are shown that the free endemic equilibrium is stable. Here we show that first endemic equilibrium is stable. Here for the second endemic equilibrium is stable, and the numerical simulation here for the both strain endemic equilibrium is stable. So here we have performed some numerical simulation to compare with clinical COVID-19 data in the Morocco between April 17, 2020, and you can see until June, the last of June. And we can see here the left side is the comparison when the free endemic community is stable, and the second when the free is this is endemic equilibrium is stable. So I will finish my work by giving some. This work will be published in conference proceedings. So here we have three streams described by E1, E2, E3, and I1, I2, I3. It's the same principle, and we can compare here with some clinical data. The importance of generalized infection that can describe better for one way. You can see here for three infection compartments: I1, I2, I3, and here you can see some references. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ali. Thank you very much for your nice talk and systematic introduction of the new incidence functions and their impact. Please, questions. We have time for questions. Please, Professor Wolpert, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Karam. This was very interesting for me because I was not very familiar with these works, unfortunately, where different incidence functions are considered. So you introduced in the beginning this, incidence function or transmission function with this denominator where you have I square in the denominator, right?
Yes.
And you also mentioned that there are some other forms of these functions. So could you please, maybe you have done the comparison with data, what incidence function, what dependence works better, for example, for COVID data? Have you done this comparison of different functions?
I will return to you see the slides?
Yes.
I will return to the slides.
Yes, maybe this graph or
this graph.
Because you show here several curves, but we did not, and you gave, in the captions there are different names, but truly speaking, I don't associate different names with different functions. So which of them work better for the data?
This is Professor Vitali. This is really, for me, it's very hard question. Our model, as I said before, this predicts only one wave, as you see. If we change the incidence function, so we have with the space here, it's more weighted, and it can predict for this wave, it can predict the evolution. So, for example, if we have some zigzag during small zigzags during the evolution, we can make it all of them to predict. In my point of view, we can plot all of them to predict. I think in my study, but as I read in other works, so there is some incidence function describes some certain medium and cannot describe other situations. Indeed,
yes,
there are some homogeneous or not homogeneous medium.
For example, in the left figure, we see that dotted red curve. It looks like it describes well the data up to certain point, up to certain date, like May something, the end of May,
yeah.
right? And this dotted red curve is what is bilinear incidence function. What is sorry, but I didn't keep in mind. What is bilinear incidence? What is the form of this function?
Yes, bilinear incidence function when f equal to beta s only, because if we meet say f s in the model, I will go to the model. You see the model?
Yes, yes.
So f s or I1 if it's equal to beta s, so the incidence will be beta s multiplied by I1.
Okay.
So this is bilinear.
Okay, thank you. In fact,
Professor Vitali, there is some assumption that I forgot to put on the slides. The assumption that the partial derivative of f depending on s is greater to 0, and the partial derivative of f or g depending on I1 and I2 is lower or equal to 0. This is in the most papers on the general incidence function. So, and these two hypotheses is verified by this bilinear, the Butandon Genis, no monotonic, and Crowley-Martin.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have much time because I see that Alberto has a question. I don't know, Gennady.
Please, yes, please. I mean, go ahead. I mean, Professor D'Onofrio. Yes.
Christina, could you allow Alberto to switch the microphone?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Nice to be with you.
If I well understood, because the K factor are this function f. F is monotonically increasing with S and decreasing in all cases with E.
Yes, this is for hypothesis. I didn't. Yes, this is hypothesis.
Okay, no, this is a crucial point, the most crucial, because the variation, the nonlinear variation of F with E is nothing else the behavioral response of the population. These classes of the contact rate were introduced by Vincenzo Capasso in 1978. Okay, these are very fundamental. But you name a series of, in the figure you showed to Vitali before, you named a series of.
You want me to? I return to the figures.
Yes, you named a series of incidence function. So first of all, incidence is the product E times F.
These two figures.
Yes. First question.
Yes.
As bilinear as incidence, do you meant the product E times F? Okay or not?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Here is written in the legend the time evolution of infected case with bilinear incidence.
Yes.
Okay. With incidence, you mean the product of the E times F or not?
By bilinear, I mean
incidence.
F, yes, bilinear incidence function F, it's equal to beta multiplied by S.
The question is not on bilinear. Forget bilinear. With incidence, you mean the product E times F or only F?
By the yes, this is a good question. Yes, in my previous paper, the incidence I call incidence beta S multiplied by I. But here, for example, I call it general incidence function, but the infection rate is F multiplied by I.
No, because F multiplied by I in epidemiology is the incidence.
Yes.
So you should change a little bit the terminology.
Yes.
And
Okay.
my second question is the following.
Yes.
You name a series of specific. Bilinear, okay, we understood. But Beddington De Angelis and Crowley-Martin, how are the Crowley-Martin and non-monotone incidence function? Where are the formula? Just to watch them.
So I will tell you the formula. So the formula.
In particular for the Crowley-Martin.
The Crowley-Martin, I'll give you the formula. So
because Beddington De Angelis is the one you use, the separated one.
The Crowley-Martin is beta S divided by 1 plus alpha 1S plus alpha 2I plus alpha 1 multiplied by alpha 2 SI.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt your discussion. I suggest to discuss later.
Just a comment. The last one is non-physical, has nothing to do with epidemiology.
Well, excuse me, Alberto. Let's discuss after, because because we are late for the next talk. I'm sorry.
So I thank everyone for attending the conference, and I am happy to be with you in the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Allali. Dear colleagues, we move to the next talk. It will be given by Mikhail Khristichenko on optimal disturbances of periodic solutions of viral infections models. Viral infections models. Please go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So, good day. My name is Michael Khristichenko, and my talk is about optimal disturbances of periodic solutions of viral infection models. So systems of delay differential equations are widely used to describe the dynamics of infection diseases and immune responses. For the models of the dynamics of viral infections, it is relevant to study the possibility of constructing multi-component impacts based on optimal disturbances that cause the maximum response and transfer the dynamical system from a state corresponding to a chronic disease to a state of a recovered organism. Since stable steady state and periodic solutions of such models can be interpreted as chronic diseases, for this study it is necessary to be able to compute optimal disturbances of steady states and periodic solutions of delayed differential equations. For time delay systems, optimal disturbances of stable steady states were determined and used for the first time in these works. It was shown that they make it possible to drive the system from a stable steady state with a high viral load to a steady state with a low viral load by applying a small disturbance. So in this talk we present the algorithm for computing optimal disturbances of stable periodic solutions of time delay systems and apply it to investigate the possibility of constructing the optimal multi-component impacts. So we consider the system of delayed differential equations where U is the n component vector of variables and F is a sufficiently smooth mapping. We assume that the initial value problem for this system has unique solutions for any piecewise continuous initial value. Let the system have some continuous stable non-negative periodic solution with the least period t. We are interested in the behavior of system in the vicinity of this periodic solution. Writing the solution in the vicinity of periodic solution like this, where nu is a real parameter with small magnitude, substituting this solution into the system and requiring that the obtained equation holds for all arbitrarily small nu, we obtain the following system of linear differential equations. By substituting the periodic solution into the nonlinear system and by differentiating the resulting equality, it is easy to check that the function which is time derivative of periodic solution satisfies the linear equation. As this function is periodic itself, it is an eigenfunction of the monodromy operator of a linear system corresponding to its eigenvalue 1. Since original nonlinear system is autonomous and the periodic solution is by presumption stable, according to the theory of stability of periodic solutions to time delay systems, all either eigenvalues of the monodromy operator lay inside the unit circle. Thus, as time tends to infinity, the solution of the Cauchy problem for the linear system with an initial function of general form will tend to this, where C is some non-zero real constant. For the vector of variables of this system, we introduce the following family of local norms at time, where D is given positive definite diagonal matrix and rho is a non-negative parameter. By the disturbance optimal at time, we mean the solution of a linear system, and we mean the solution of the linearized system that maximizes the amplification of the local norm of the disturbance at the moment t with star, compared with its initial value. So this is the solution of linear system on which the maximum of the following value is attained. And since by definition the disturbance optimal at time is a solution of linear system, and hence it is completely determined by its values in this interval, along with the choice of the norm in which the optimization is carried out, it is important to choose an appropriate subspace of functions from which the initial values are taken. This subspace will be denoted by Q. In practice, it is sufficient to choose Q as the linear span of some finite set of piecewise continuous basis functions. Note that for stable steady states of this system with delay, along with the disturbance optimal at time, there is a global optimal disturbance which is understood as a non-zero solution of the linear system at which this value attains its maximum. It is convenient to seek the optimal disturbance of steady states in two steps. First, we find the maximum amplification of the local norm of the solution to system, where the maximum is taken of all solution with non-zero initial values belonging to subspace of initial functions. And then we find at which time the function, which is called the maximum amplification, attains its maximum. And then we find the optimal disturbance of the steady states. In contrast to the maximum amplification of a stable steady state, the maximum amplification of a stable periodic solution, generally speaking, does not reach its maximum at finite time, since in the optimal disturbance of a periodic solution, there is a non-damping mode corresponding to the eigenvalue of the monodromy operator equal to 1. Therefore, for a periodic solution, the global optimal disturbance has no meaning. Taking this into account, we will further consider only disturbances that are optimal at given moments of time. The found disturbance of periodic solution optimal at time is used to perturb the periodic solution of the original nonlinear system by choosing this as initial value. This is the normalized, and where this is normalized in the L2 norm disturbance optimal at time, and epsilon is a real parameter. By varying the magnitude of this parameter, we can increase or decrease the initial disturbance. Depending on its sign, the given component of the solution begins either to increase or decrease for time more than 0. The disturbances optimal time can be computed using any different scheme suitable for solving the initial value problems for system of delayed differential equations. We use the implicit second order scheme BDF2 on the uniform grid. After discretization, a linearized system takes the following form. Assuming that the grid step is sufficiently small, we write this equation like this. We also supplement this equation with the identities to obtain the following system of equations. It can be shown that the grid analog of the local norm can be written as this. And the grid analog of maximum amplification can be written like this, where P is the matrix product of these matrices, and Q is the matrix, the columns of which form a basis in the grid analog of subspace Q. To compute the grid analog of the disturbance of optimal time, it is sufficient to compute the normalized right single vector of the matrix, this matrix, corresponding to its maximal singular value, and then compute the initial value of the grid analog of the desired optimal disturbance by the following formula. So we conducted some numerical experiments, and numerical experiments were conducted with the mathematical model of experimental infection with lymphocytic meningitis virus. This model is formulated as a system of nonlinear delayed differential equations, and it describes the dynamic of concentration of viruses, population density of 2 LCMV specific cytotoxic lymphocytes, its precursors and effectors, and the cumulative viral load. The system has the following form. As the basis functions for computing the disturbance optimal at time, we will use the following functions that qualitatively approximate the behavior of drugs in the one compartment and two compartment pharmacokinetic models. So in the first work, it was shown that for the parameters written in this slide, the system has 4 steady states with the 0 viral load, low viral load, and 2 steady states with the high viral load. Also in this work it was shown that the first 3 steady states are unstable, and the 4th steady state is stable. And in the second work, it was shown that in the neighborhood of the second steady state, there is periodic solution. This periodic solution is shown in this figure. So in this figure, we can see the maximum amplification of the disturbance of periodic solution. And as we can see, it has a form resembling the periodic form. So, and in the first line of this table, the maximum amplification and the initial moment and the moments of time equal from 1 to 5 least periods of periodic solution is shown. And in the second and the third line of this table, the norm of eigenfunction in the eigenmode expansion of the disturbance optimal at time equal to the least period, which will be considered further and will be called just optimal disturbance. And the norm of the remain of this expansion are shown. As we can see, the norm of the eigenfunction tend to 1 with the increasing time, and the norm of the remain decreases. This is consistent with the fact that any solution of linear system tend to eigenfunction multiplied by some non-zero real constant. So, in this figure, the comparison of the local norms of the optimal disturbance, which is shown by the blue line, and the eigenfunction, which is shown by the red line, are shown. As we can see, the forms of these curves are similar to each other, but the magnitude of the local norm of the optimal disturbance is bigger. So in this figure, a solution of the initial value problem for a linear system in this interval with the normalized eigenfunction, which is shown by the red line, and normalized optimal disturbance, which is shown by the blue line, taken as initial value, are shown. As we can see, the magnitude of the amplitude of a solution of the initial value problem for linearized system with the normalized eigenfunction taken as an initial value is much smaller than the magnitude of the amplitude of the solution for a linearized system in with normalized optimal disturbance taken as an initial value. So, as optimal disturbance consists of eigenfunction and remain, we tried to disturb periodic solution of a nonlinear system with eigenfunction itself. To transfer system from periodic solution to the vicinity of steady state with zero viral load, it's turned out to be necessary to disturb initial value of periodic solution with eigenfunction with L2 norm equal to absolute value of this epsilon. In this figure by the red line is shown the disturbed periodic solution, and by the black line is original periodic solution without disturbance. And these results were obtained by integration of the original nonlinear equations. As we disturbed periodic solution with optimal disturbance, it turned out to be sufficient to disturb initial value of periodic solution with optimal disturbance with significantly lesser L2 norm. As we can see, the value of the absolute value of the epsilon is significantly smaller in comparison with this epsilon which was taken for the eigenfunction. And this can be interpreted as lesser impact on the system. It should be noted that the most significant impact of the optimal disturbance was in decreasing the viral load. In this figure, it is shown that it is not sufficient to take eigenfunctions with epsilon, which is equal to the epsilon with which optimal disturbance was taken to transfer system from periodic solution. We also studied the dependence of the optimal disturbance of periodic solution on the phase shift of this periodic solution. As we can see in this figure, the optimal disturbance is computed for initial periodic solution. It's shown in this subfigure. And for periodic solution with phase shift T max, where T max is time where periodic solution attains its maximum. It is shown in subfigure B, are significantly different. So to transfer system from periodic solution to the close neighborhood of steady state with zero Y-load rho, it is necessary to take optimal disturbance with L2 norm equal to 5. So in comparison with the optimal disturbance computed for original periodic solution, where the viral load decreased significantly, in this optimal disturbance, which was computed for the phase-shifted periodic solution, the most impacts are on the variables of the immune response. So in conclusion, I would like to say that in this work, a new original technology for computation of the optimal disturbances of periodic solutions was proposed. Its efficiency was demonstrated by the example of periodic solutions of model of dynamics of infection caused by lymphocytic Korean meningitis virus, and it was shown that the optimal disturbance allow one to transfer system from periodic solution, which can be interpreted as chronic disease, to the close neighborhood steady state with zero viral load, which can be interpreted as state of the recovered organism. So in the future, developed algorithms to compute optimal disturbances will be applied for the periodic solutions of the Marchuk-Petrov model of antiviral immune response, and moreover, a study of the dependence of the optimal disturbance of a periodic solution on the phase shift of the periodic solution will be conducted to help us to understand at which time it is optimal to begin the therapy of the chronic diseases. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mikhail, for your nice talk and for presenting the recent advances in the analysis of this complex delay differential equation system and their responsiveness to external perturbation, which are very promising for the application in treatment of chronic diseases. Please, are there any questions? Please, Vitaly. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mikhail, for this very interesting work. It seems to me that I missed something in your explanation, because as far as I understand what you said at the end, you have a periodic solution and you have a stationary solution without oscillations, and you can shift your solution from periodic solution to this stationary solution. Is it right, or I missed something?
This is not completely right, because the stationary solution of this system with viral load equal to 0 are unstable. So
this is exactly my question, because it looks like that I did not understand. So could you please clarify this question?
So we don't try to reach exactly this steady state, but we try to put down this chronic disease as much time as possible to make less impact on the organism. So in this picture, we can see that the viral load is don't have these peaks, which periodic solution has. No, the disturbed solution don't have these peaks, and is the value of the one of the variables of that immune response is high, this allows us to stay in the proximity of the steady state with a low viral load for a long time.
Yes, but this perturbation, it's not just instantaneous, but you keep it for all times, right?
No, this disturbance is, as I said in this, one moment, what in this slide, this disturbance is only it disturbs solutions on the initial interval of the maximum delay.
No,
So
but then if you don't keep it after that, then I don't understand why the system cannot return again to these oscillations with high viral load if you don't have this disturbance anymore.
It can exactly after, but after a longer period of time, it can return.
Okay. Yes, okay.
But we try to put a system with to a state with a lower viral load as long as we can.
Okay.
At this point of time, further, I think when we will go to experimenting with Marchuk-Petrov model, which is more biologically significant, I think we will find the states where there is stable periodic solutions, stable steady states, and we will try to switch between these regimes to show with optimal disturbances.
Yes, I understand. But here this solution, it's a transient solution, and this blue line after some time will return to these periodic oscillations with high viral load peaks. So you need to apply again. So you need to apply periodically, right? Your disturbance from time to time to keep this blue line at a low level, right?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yes, I understand now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions, dear colleagues? Then I would like to thank again Khristichenko for his nice talk, and we move to the last speaker, Dmitry Grebennikov, who will present mathematical modeling of intracellular life cycle of HIV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 viruses. Please go ahead, Dmitry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
All right, thanks. Thank you for the introduction. So the topic of my talk will be about the intracellular regulation of two viruses, the human immunodeficiency virus and the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. The outline of the talk is the follows. For each virus, the structure will be the following. First, I will talk about the deterministic model, ODE-based models, which were developed, and then about their calibration and their validation by the available data, and then I will proceed to the development of a stochastic model and the associated results. And finally, I'll move to the sensitivity analysis of these models, both deterministic and stochastic, for both viruses. And the motivation for this work was to develop the detailed, sufficiently detailed models which and to apply them by predicting the targets for development of antiviral drugs. So using the sensitivity analysis, we can predict, we can quantify the impact of different model parameters and the corresponding processes, which of these processes have the most impact on the production of the new viruses during the life cycle. So yes, and these materials were published in the following papers. So I cannot talk about all the details of model calibration and even to present all the equations, but you can read them online. So let me move to the HIV-1 life cycle. Here's the biochemical scheme of the processes, and you can see the scheme of the structure of HIV. This is a virus which infects human CD4 positive T cells, immune cells, and it has certain structures. So it has some structural proteins, and it have inside of it the 2 genomic RNAs of this virus, which need to be replicated in the host cell. And also there are some auxiliary proteins which assist in these processes. And the life cycle means the infection of the cell from infecting it with free virions and up to the point of releasing new virions in much more numbers. So let me move through this scheme to comment on the processes which are modeled. And here all the components correspond to the variable in the equations. So we have free virions, extracellular virions, which can bind to the receptor of the cell, and if they do so, they become transform to the bound state. We call it another variable v-bound. Next, the internals of the virus are released inside the cytoplasm of the cell, and for HIV, it's its RNAs. And next, the scheme is as follows. This virus can integrate in the chromosomes of the host cell in a form of DNA. So first of all, it needs to reverse transcribe itself from RNA to DNA. And then this DNA moves inside the nucleus where it can be integrated to the host genome. And at this point, the cell can cell is infected at this point. And there are 2 possible scenarios. One, the cell can become latently infected, and all the stages after that will be halted for some time. It can be months or even years of latent infections. We do not describe these mechanisms, but we describe only the state at which the cell is productively infected, and all the subsequent processes are happening instantaneously. So the processes can be divided roughly in 2 stages. It's the transcription phase, in which the mRNAs are produced, which are templates for the synthesis of the proteins, and the synthesis of the proteins is called the translation phase. And then these RNAs and proteins are assembled together in new virions, which are then budded and become matured. Now let's move more closely into these stages. So first of all, the genomic full-length mRNAs are produced with some basal rate, and then they become spliced to smaller versions, single spliced and double spliced RNA. Then all of them need to be exported to the cytoplasm to begin the synthesis of the proteins. And each RNA is a template for a certain type of protein. So there are structural proteins which constitute the structure of the virus, and also regulatory proteins, TAT and REF. And they provide the backwards feedback, and they increase the rate of transcription up to 10,000-fold, and also they increase the rate of splicing and export of RNAs. And then I already described, it's only the assembly phase which occurs at the membrane, and budding and maturation. So the deterministic model is an ODE-based and can be presented in this form. It comprises 24 variables and 51 parameters. The model was formulated using the law of mass action, and also in some places we used Michaelis-Menten nonlinear functions. And it was calibrated, so we provided the baseline estimates for the parameter values and for the admissible ranges based on the available experimental data. And for HIV, it was, I would say, more easier because we based our works upon previous models, but for SARS-CoV-2, we needed to calibrate this model from scratch. So let me present the equations of the first stages. They're just, for the most part, they are very simple equations which provide the elementary reactions of either transport or of the variables to different place in the cell, or the synthesis of new ones, or the transformation in another type. So here we have the free variants and the number of bound variants, and then after these bound variants are fused inside the cytoplasm, they secrete the genomic RNAs, and then with the rate of reverse transcriptions we get the DNAs. And all the subsequent stages have the similar equations, except for the following modifications. The effects of regulatory proteins have been parameterized with Michaelis-Menten functions. So these functions occur in certain and corresponding parts of the right-hand side of the equations. And for final stage of assembly, the rate of producing new variants was proportional initially to the all components which need to be assembled. So to the RNA which are on the membrane, and to the proteins, structural proteins which are on the membrane. But later we modified the model by limiting the assembly rate using the Michaelis-Menten equations by the least abundant protein, and we borrowed this approach from another models of influenza intracellular replication. So here you can see the numerical solution of the deterministic model for initial condition of 4 extracellular variants. Here you can see that the variants are bounded to the membrane, then the RNAs are secreted in the cytoplasm, and then the DNA is integrated. And for 4 virions, we have about 1 to 2 DNAs integrated. And then throughout 6 to 8 hours, the transcription phase begins. And later on, first the regulatory proteins are secreted, and after they are in the after there are enough of them, the other processes of transcription and protein translations are amplified. And at the later stages, we see that around 12 hours after infection, we have new progeny virions produced by the cell. And for 4 initial infection dose, it is about 100 particles for 1 day for the duration of this life cycle. Next, we move to the stochastic model. And this is done by formulating these, reformulating these ODE equations to the discrete state continuous time Markov chain. And this is pretty standard approach, and there are some methods to simulate these Markov chains. The most known in the biochemistry field is the Gillespie algorithm, and this is the Monte Carlo simulation, which I will talk about a little later. And we also use the hybrid approach, which switches between stochastic and deterministic methods when the variables reach their thresholds, pre-specified thresholds, to increase the speed of simulations. So here is the part of Markov chain that corresponds to the first entry and reverse transcription stages for equations for which were shown before. So we see that each process have the propensity. So this is the probability that this transition will occur during the infinitesimal time, and upon transition, some variables can be switched by either decreasing by 1 or increased by 1. And here is the result for the stochastic model for HIV. Here only the evolution of the histograms for the first and for the last variable of this model of the replication cycle are shown. So we can see that for the first variable and many intermediate variables up to the integration part, these density are just surrounded around the, so the median of this distribution is close to the solution of the deterministic system. But we see for the final variable, we have some heterogeneity in distribution. And this is a very interesting result. So we have for 4 initial variants, not about 100 particles, but depending on the realization, it can produce either 80 or 120 or 200 particles at the end of the life cycle. And also using this stochastic approach, we can estimate the probability of productive infection, i.e. that the DNA would become integrated upon a certain time into the cell, so it would become productively infected. And depending on the initial dose, the initial value for V3. And we see that at the end of lifetime cycle, we have some heterogeneity in the number of integrated progeny. And this heterogeneity is then moved to the all subsequent variables. So we have this multimodular distribution for the model output, the number of released matured variants. And also using this model, we can even more validate it using the experimental data on the time of on the distributions of the activity of the certain stages of this life cycle. So this is the experimental image borrowed from the article 24 hours of HIV life cycle, and here it can be compared with the plot of intensities of certain processes. Next, let me move to the life cycle of SARS-CoV-2. It have some differences from the HIV, and the most crucial of them is that it doesn't integrate into the host genome. So all the transcription and translation phases occur in the cytoplasm. And we have less detailed model. It has 13 equations, 13 variables, which are also displayed in the scheme. So the extracellular variants, they can also bind to the receptor on the membrane. Then the bounded variants can enter in the endosome. Then they encode the genomic RNA. And first of all, in this process, the non-structural proteins are translated, which will amplify the subsequent transcription phases. And transcription occurs in double membrane vesicles. And first of all, the negative sense RNA is produced, and then finally we have produced positive sense RNA in the cytoplasm, which can now synthesize the proteins. So we have nucleocapsid proteins, which wrap around the RNA and become a ribonucleocapsid, and some structural proteins. So we have the association of ribonucleocapsid, and then the assembly of the variants, which are then released to the extracellular environment. So the ODE model has 12 variables and 27 parameters, and it has roughly the same structure and approach in its construction. So for the entry phase, the equations are shown on the slide. They're pretty similar, and there are only first order reactions here. So each variable with some rate is transformed from one to another. So with combined from the free to the bound, with diffuse to the endosome, etc., etc. And the regulations, nonlinear regulations, are also considered for transcription phase in the effect of NSP on the transcription, and also both stages of assembly are modeled with Michaelis-Menten type functions. So here is the function for creation of ribonucleocapsids, and here is the function for creating the final variants, which is included in these terms. And then the variants, assembled variants, are released. Now, for model calibration, we can group the parameters in three categories. We estimated the best calibrated values, baseline values for them, and also their plausible ranges for their variations. And for some of them, we could do this from the literature. And for some, we needed to do the uncertainty quantifications. And for some, we can correct using the uncertainty quantification the initially derived ranges. And this is done by using the Latin hypercube sampling of model parameters from the assumed ranges. And by sampling them, we can provide the regions of model uncertainty, and we can modify the plausible ranges of model parameters so that the provided uncertainty matches the data which is known from the literature. And here is the solution of the deterministic model for initial value of 10 free variants. And finally, after around 10 hours, the release of assembled new progeny is beginning. And we have around 100 also assembled released particles for this initial value. Here is the picture of model calibration, which was model validation by some available experimental data. So first there is some challenges in that the experimental data is conducted on the cell culture, but not on this. These are not single cell experiments. So we can only plot and use the relative quantities, such as the ratios of positive to negative sense RNA, or the fold change of the released progeny kinetics. And you can see that it reproduces the known data well. Then we can also move to stochastic model, and here are some results for this model. So we see that the means and medians are nearly the deterministic solution, and we have the estimated range of uncertainty predicted by this stochastic model. And also we can predict the probability of cell infection depending on the number of variants which infect this cell. And also these curves can be done for various values of the binding rates. So this can be predicted for different variants of the SARS-CoV-2. And also for the assembly stage, it's just a small detail. I'm not sure if I have time to. Okay, so this can be modeled with two different approaches, because when we have an assembly of two types of variables, we have one of them, for example, and an SP number of structural proteins which need to be provided to assemble one variant. And we can use probability weighting scheme and either simulate the increase by n number for these for corresponding variables, or with different weighted propensity functions, we can stick to the classic Markov chain, where the variables are increased or decreased by only one. And next, let me move to the sensitivity analysis for both stochastic and deterministic model. We analyze the influence of parameters on some model output of interest. So this is the function of the model solution, and it can be the integral up to time t of the mature to released variance, or so the area under the curve type of functional, or the number of progeny produced during the life cycle. And also we can know which parameters impact the difference from some experimental data using this type of function. So here in this slide, I provide the different methods which are available for sensitivity analysis of deterministic models. They can be categorized in local methods and global. And local, they find the following formally defined sensitivity indices, which are just the local derivative of the functional to each parameter. And they can also be normalized by parameter values to be able to compare them in range. And there are two approaches. The direct method can be used, or also the joint method, which more efficient when there are many parameters in the model. And global methods differ from this approach in that they can provide the contribution of each parameter to the model output when all the model parameters can be varied simultaneously. And basically, in each of the methods, the parameters are sampled from their sim distributions using Latin hypercube sampling, Sobel sequence sampling, or other equiprobable sampling methods. And then there are some metrics, either regression-based, the correlation coefficient, or the variance decomposition-based quantity, which can also provide the sensitivity measure. And then for stochastic models, we also have done the local sensitivity analysis. And for this, we need to define some measure between the probability distribution functions at some time. So here we use the histogram difference between two sets, the baseline with the PDF of model output with baseline parameters and with parameters which are varied by some small number, for example, by 1%. And we used both local and global approaches for deterministic model, and local for the stochastic model to the following functions. And here are the results. So on the scheme, the most sensitive types of processes are marked with these asterisks. And for HIV, we can see that these targets are not currently used in the available antiviral treatment because they either inhibit the reverse transcriptase, so this stage, or integrase, or early and the later stages. So we have some predicted potential targets for development of antiviral treatment. And the same is for SARS-CoV. The most sensitive processes are the degradation of positive sense gRNA in cytoplasm and the tolerance of transcription to the number of non-structural proteins. So conclusions, we developed the models of both virion viruses life cycles, which are calibrated, validated, and provide the quantitative tools to study the intracellular replication of the viruses. And stochastic models, they provide additional probabilistic predictions and can also be used for validation of the model by the data of temporal distributions. And systematic sensitivity analysis is used to predict the potential targets for antiviral drug development. And these models can be integrated in the hybrid models to either predict some relevant in vivo situations, or they can be used to infer data from experimental protocols. So some types of viral growth in cell cultures or the plaque forming unit assays. I'd like to thank my colleagues and you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, for your for a very clear and systematic presentation of this important aspects of infectious disease modeling. Please, do we have questions? Yes, Vitaly, please go ahead.
Yes, Dmitry, thanks. It's really interesting for me because, as you mentioned at the end of your talk, for this viral plaque growth and this multiplicity of infection assays, what we do, we study this in particular for this new coronavirus, how this infection propagates in cell culture. I will talk about this tomorrow. But we don't put this detailed kinetics of virus replication. We consider very simplified, just replication rate in a quite simple model. So it might be quite interesting to compare these two different approaches. I would say that even simple kinetics works very well. That in fact there are basically two parameters. It's time delay, but time delay can be easily estimated. It's about 10 hours, as you showed also in your data. And then there's only one parameter for this replication rate, this global parameter, and it allows, together with some other things, to describe quite well this virus infection propagation development in cell culture. So maybe we'll have an occasion to discuss it in more detail. But my question today is a little bit different. It's a very specific question. You mentioned in the beginning when you described HIV infection that there are in fact two possibilities, and we know about these two possibilities, either latently infected cells or actively infected cells. Could you comment on the biological mechanisms which make a choice between these two options? In other words, probably there are some molecules, proteins, or something else which are present or which are lacking, which determines the choice between these two possibilities. Could you explain us what happens there?
Yes, sure. So, these mechanisms are not modeled and not even considered in our.
No, I understand that you did not study it, but maybe you can explain.
No, I cannot provide the sufficiently detailed answer to this question. There are many of them. But it depends on the activation state of the function. So there are some molecular signaling. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Maybe I can ask. Maybe I can add. Something that actually, signaling via T cell receptor. Expressed on CD4 T cell, which leads to activation of the cell. Actually leads to the induction of the cell cycle progression. And if there is viral DNA integrated in the host chromosome, then it will be transcribed and the replication starts. But if the cell is in a quiescent or in resting state, that then the infection doesn't go, and the proviral DNA will be latent and silent until the cell gets activated. And also, not all type of cell activation can lead to the production of the viruses, because so-called, for example, homeostatic proliferation or bystander proliferation can, in some cases, this doesn't lead to the active production of the virus.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. Thank you for this explanation. It's really important for us to understand. But this is for HIV. What is known about coronavirus? Can it be latently infected? These cells, in particular epithelial cells, or it doesn't happen like that?
Yeah, from the general point of view, because the transcription of the virus, so actually the virus has encoded in its RNA genome all it needs, basically. So just when it enters to the cell and gets uncoated, then the first phase of the virus, of the viral DNA transcription and translation starts, which leads to the creation of the replication complex. So it basically it is much less dependent on the cellular resources which are needed for the transcription. But there were some studies in which they discussed that actually, the viral RNA actually can get integrated. But I'm not sure whether this was really this kind of information is really nicely documented, or it's more like artifact.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer.
Thank you. So, dear colleagues, then we have successfully finished our morning session, and I wish you a nice break, and then at 2 p.m. there will Moscow time, there will be the next afternoon session. So everybody is welcome.
Yes, thank you very much for all participants, also for our chairman. And as you say, we have 1 hour break and we meet for the next plenary lecture and the session on blood flow and coagulation. Okay, see you later. Bye.
Bye. Bye.